Hey folks, Randy Newberg here with another episode of Leupold Hunt Talk Radio. We sometimes call it Randy Newberg Unfiltered. I don't think we'll be that unfiltered today because I have two really smart people here, two doctors of their world of research in wildlife disease. And I think when you listen to what they have to say and hear the fact that they are both hunters, that they approach this from strictly the science side of things, and you put that in context or in contrast probably with some of the craziness you've heard in the last 6 months about supposed media people like myself being CWD experts. If you've listened to some of them, there are some blowhards who don't know sick 'em from come here about CWD, but they're out on all the media platforms claiming to be experts in CWD, chronic wasting disease. Well, I can assure you the two people you're going to hear on this podcast are experts. They present on this topic. They've been researching it. They've been trying to work on management strategies their entire careers. So they happen to be in Bozeman, Montana for a media summit about chronic wasting disease. And I was lucky enough to get them on this podcast. But before we get to them, what we're going to do is quickly tell you who makes this podcast possible. There's a reason we call it Leupold Hunt Talk Radio, because Leupold sponsors everything that we do. They are the greatest company I could ever ask for a partner. Whether it's hunting, public lands, conservation, you name it, they are big supporters. And I hope when you are looking for optics, you realize that and you make them one of your considerations and look at Leupold. Look for those gold rings. Those will tell you they are made in Beaverton, Oregon. And they are fantastic optics. We also have the great folks from Go Hunt, GoHunt.com, their insider program. I think pretty soon they're going to end their 30-day free trial. So if you're wondering how it is that me and my crew, that we draw all these tags to hunt, I think this year we've got 14 different hunts we're going on. If you wonder how we do our research, how we get information, draw odds, everything else, here's your chance. Right now, if you go do this, go to gohunt.com/Randy. And with that, you will get a 30-day free trial of the entire package of the Go Hunt Insider program. Yep. I mean, like every part of it. There's none of this, we'll just show you a little bit of it. For those 30 days, if you sign up, you're going to get to see the entire thing. So, gohunt.com/Randy and get your 30-day free trial. Orion Coolers. How much more can I say about Orion Coolers? We've been living out of them already this year for about a month. We're going to live out of them for another 3 months. They are just unbelievable coolers. They get abused and beat up and mistreated, and they look like brand new. They just keep chugging along, keeping our food cold, letting us get all of our meat back home without any concerns about spoilage. They are just fantastic coolers. So go to orioncoolers.com and use promo code Randy, and they're going to throw in this really cool tumbler for anyone who uses that promo code. And then we have the great folks at Onyx Maps, or Onyx, however, whatever term you want to use. We've been using their stuff forever, since they started, and it's an unbelievable product. The old saying of what would I have done without it, or what did I do without it before it came along? That's the question I always ask about my Onyx. There's no way we could hunt the places we do. We couldn't even apply for the tags we apply for without the comfort of knowing that Onyx is in our hands. You look at we're always walking around with our smartphones out in the woods. No, we're not on Facebook. We're not on Instagram. We are on the Onyx system when you see that. And it's an unbelievable tool. To have all that in the palm of your hand is amazing. So go to onxmaps.com, and if you use promo code Randy, you're going to get 20% off all of their app products. So onxmaps.com, promo code Randy. And with that, I'm going to click the button here that puts all of us on the mic together. And Krysten and Kelly are going to be here, and I think you're going to enjoy this podcast. It is going to be very, very interesting. I'll try not to interject because I'm here to learn. And before we turned on the mics here, just talking to these two has shown me how much, I'll call it misinformation. Some people would call it lies. We'll use the polite term misinformation is out there on CWD. And when it's all done, I hope you understand that as a hunter, you have a responsibility to know about this disease and do what you can to be part of the management processes, the management strategies. Because if we say hunters are conservationists, well, we have the responsibility to do what we can to help when things like this occur out on the landscape. So with that, here we go, folks. Well, folks, I told you that when you get done listening to this in the next hour to 2 hours, you're almost going to get a PhD in wildlife disease. Because I have with me two experts who happen to be hunters, who happen to focus a lot of their work, if not all of their work, on this topic we call chronic wasting disease. And if you're a hunter and you don't know what chronic wasting disease is, or CWD as we'll probably call it in this podcast, you have been living under a rock for the last 10 years. And part of the reason I'm excited to talk about this with these two individuals is because there seems to be a glut of misinformation purposefully going on in the hunting world. There's an old washed up rock and roll guy who decided that he was going to become a CWD expert. I think that he probably should have kept his mouth shut and then he wouldn't put his foot in it so much. But anyhow, that's a personal opinion there, and probably have my two guests saying, gee, Randy, that's quite a way to introduce things. But anyhow, we call this Randy Newberg Unfiltered, and the reason it's unfiltered is because I'm sick and tired of hunters, especially hunters who have platforms, acting like they know what they're talking about with CWD, because quite honestly, they are clueless. And the hope of this is that we're going to get a lot of really good facts, a lot of really good information. And since both these people are hunters, it'll give some credibility and some relevance to all of us, because we can't ignore this any longer. Ignoring it is not going to solve it. It doesn't help with the management of it. And the more information we have, the better we can be part of the solutions that are the management outcomes that will help in some way manage this disease. So with that, with me all the way from Lansing, Michigan, is Kelly Straka. Kelly, thanks.
Hi, Randy. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And all the way from Ithaca, New York, Cornell University. I got to put in a plug for Cornell because my son has been on this podcast many times. It's his alum, is Krysten Schuler. Both of these people have way more knowledge, way more degrees, way more everything than I will ever have. Well, if there was a PhD in BS, I'd have that. In fact, I might be able to teach that class. But Kelly and Krysten are here, and they are in Bozeman because Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partners has hosted the Media Summit. And one of the topics that these two got to talk about and give media information about is chronic wasting disease. So if the two of you are comfortable with this, we are going to have a serious discussion about CWD as it relates to hunters. I'm interested in how you see it through the lens of veterinarians, of researchers, of scientists, and people who have to take information on extremely volatile. What is volatile the right word to describe this topic?
I think volatile.
Controversy.
It's become volatile.
Yeah,
I don't think it
has.
needs to be, but it seems to be going that way.
So, Krysten, why everyone thinks it has. And I shouldn't say everyone. A lot of people think it has to be volatile. Is that just because there's a lack of information out there?
Well, I think at a very basic level, we all care about deer and elk and hunting and enjoying the outdoors. And here we have a disease that we know is fatal and that we know can affect populations, and it can affect our culture of hunting and conservation dollars coming in, and that affects a lot of other programs. So this disease has the potential to really affect even larger groups than just hunters. And in wrapping your arms and your head around this disease, it's really complicated. And I think that a lot of people just say, oh, it's too complicated.
Yeah.
Mother Nature will take care of it. We don't have to worry about it. And that's sort of an easier row to hoe.
Yeah. Well, I often say that if you can't explain it in a Facebook meme, you're not going to get people's attention. So something this complicated with tentacles going so many places isn't very well defined by a Facebook meme.
Yeah, and I think to follow up on what you asked a second ago too, why is some of these issues surrounding CWD, why is it so volatile, and why is there so much misinformation out there? And I think it's because it's almost human nature anytime we have a really complex issue that we can't quite wrap our heads around to be like, well, whose fault is it, right?
Right.
Because it's obviously not mine.
Yeah.
And so we want to find somebody to pin it on. And depending on who you are, that other group is obviously going to be the ones to blame. Mm-hmm. And I hear it across the board in pretty much every group setting I'm in. It's somebody else's fault.
Yeah.
And let's figure out, what we can do to stop them or get them to change their ways. And yet we're kind of, I said this yesterday too on the panel, where we as hunters are long overdue to accept our responsibility in potentially making things worse. And I'm not blaming anyone. I'm saying that we need to be accountable for our actions and acknowledge what risk factors we know about, because trust me, we know a lot. We do. We have a lot more to learn, but we know a lot of risk factors, and they are things that we do. They're our bread and butter as hunters. We love hunting, and we should love hunting, but the way that we hunt can potentially make this worse.
Wow.
I'll actually take away the potential. The way that we hunt can make this worse.
Yeah.
So
and not purposefully, just because
absolutely not.
We don't have enough information. It's the way Dad did it, or Grandpa did it, or the neighbor did it, and so I did it without even thinking about it.
And full disclosure, I work for a state wildlife agency that I'm proud of. It's a really good group of people, and we are not conspiracy theorists trying to end hunting not because it pays my paychecks, but because we love hunting and we love the resource, and this is important.
Yeah.
So no, I don't have a secret fund kickback of all the conspiracy monies that I've accumulated over the years. The truth of the matter is, the resource matters and this disease matters, and the sooner we just accept that and swallow that really big bitter pill, the better we're all off. So.
Well, Kelly, you've just thrown out there the first myth of research.
It's a MythBuster campaign, right?
Yeah. So maybe Krysten's getting all the money.
Yeah.
If you talk to the if you talk to the critics, you people like you just make this up so that you can make a lot of money.
I regret to inform your bold listeners here that we are on my private yacht right now, recording this in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, we're not in Bozeman.
We're not in a shady hotel room. Not shady. This is a great hotel room. But yeah, I mean, bottom line is that no, this is not a conspiracy theory. At least not one that I'm aware of. And if it is, I certainly have been not engaged enough because I'm not seeing the benefits.
Well, folks, for those of you who know me, before we turned down the headset, I told Kelly and Krysten that you got to be ready because Randy tries to make humor of just about everyone and everything, including himself. But this topic maybe isn't deserving of that much humor because of how critical it is. Krysten, you were talking about how many effects this has. And when I talk about things in the hunting world and try to measure at its most basic level, what's it going to affect? I just look at things like the North American model, okay? It's usually a state-based model or state-based management. Well, CWD doesn't know state boundaries. It has things about science-based management. Well, from what I've seen in the last few years, the science that people like you are part of seems to be getting discounted by people who have connections or influence, and I don't want either of you to say anything that's going to get you in trouble, but
well, no, I'm very glad that you brought up the North American model, because I think that's something that we embrace wholeheartedly, and it's very important. And so when we talk about wildlife health, whether it's CWD or any other, pick your disease, in that definition of wildlife health, it's not just freedom from disease, it's how that animal fills its ecological role and its value to society. So when we have a disease like CWD, we're missing that ecological role, and the value to society is potentially diminished. If you have people that stop hunting, or, you're not getting those non-residents because they don't want to go to that area anymore. And these are our public trust assets.
Right.
And they're hugely valuable. And we put these assets in the hands of our public trustees, our elected officials. And so these people are supposed to think about the value of these assets, not only for this generation and what we want to do with it, but future generations. And then that rolls down to the public trust managers, our fish and wildlife agencies that are responsible for managing these diseases. And so I think that we're at the point now with CWD where our public trustees, our elected officials, the politicians are not hearing enough from the owners of these assets that are saying, hey, this is a problem and I'm upset. I think you should be doing more on this front because this is diminishing the quality of my ownership of this resource. And I want, I used to say, what do you think about your grandkids hunting? And seeing how prevalence rates are increasing in some of these states so quickly.
CWD prevalence.
CWD prevalence in states like Wisconsin and even Pennsylvania now. I mean, they're going up at an exponential rate. That curve is very steep, and it's different than what we've seen in some of the Western states. Now I've backed it down to, do you want your grandkids to hunt? Now it's, do you want your kids to hunt?
Wow.
I mean, I'm worried about my own 5-year-old son that, where are they going to hunt? And, what is the quality of that hunt going to be if, they're looking at a really high prevalence rate, a high opportunity to shoot a CWD positive animal.
Yeah. Well, and the reason I bring it back to something as simple as the North American model, most of my listeners are very familiar with that. And when you bring up the public trust doctrine and the trusteeship and all that, it resonates very well with why the two of you and your peers have a very vested interest in this, both professionally, for what you do and your agencies do. It just is. It can't be ignored any longer. But before we get too far down this path, do me the favor of making sure I don't have in my mind some false facts about what CWD is. Chronic wasting disease. If I pick up a magazine, it's like some sort of flaked out protein that becomes a prion that gets in the brain and causes encephalopathy, blah, blah. So that's an accountant, Randy Newberg, trying to interpret what the two of you do for your work. So tell my audience what CWD really is, either of you or both of you.
Okay, I'll start it, and Krysten will fill in the holes. So what we know about chronic wasting disease is that you were right. It's caused by, I've never heard the term flaky protein. Which is,
you'll have to trademark that one.
Endearing. Yeah, I like that. There's a publication, I can't remember who authored it, but talks about CWD prion as a rogue protein. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. I like that. So what we've got going on is that we know we've got proteins in our bodies, okay? And some of our proteins, there's a group called prions or prions. I refer to them as prions.
Okay.
But so a prion, what we know about it is that we know that these proteins are always being made in our bodies, right? We are like these masters of constantly reformulating things. So you have proteins going through your bodies. They get old, right? They get weak. So your body breaks them down and gets rid of them. Okay, this happens all the time. And then we make new ones. We're amazing factories. With these prions, when they're being made, something happens that when it's being made, it misfolds. So basically, if you take a piece of paper and you fold it into a paper airplane, I can pass messages across the room all day long. But if I take that same piece of paper and I crumple it into a ball, I'm a left-handed girl. I'm a terrible thrower. Not because I'm left-handed or because I'm a girl. It's a nature. It's a characteristic of myself. So if I were to wad a piece of paper, that same piece of paper that was this really efficient paper airplane, and I wad it into a ball and I throw it, it's not going to go that far. It's the exact same piece of paper, right? But how I folded it mattered. So all of a sudden you have a protein that as it's being made, and we don't know the trigger, we don't know why it folds wrong, but it does. And when it misfolds, it stops functioning like normal. So it all of a sudden doesn't facilitate any sort of communication that it normally would. It doesn't serve its normal purpose. Not only that, the body can't get rid of it. It can't break it down. So it goes to unfold that paper airplane. It goes to unfold the wadded up ball, and it can't do it. And so the body can't get rid of it. It doesn't recognize it as an invader, as a pathogen, because it's a normal protein. So you have this useless ball, right? Just sitting there. And here's the other kicker, and this is where the rogue protein thing comes into play, and I think it's really interesting. If that wadded up protein that's misfolded, if it contacts another protein, a perfectly happy functioning protein, prion protein, it can make that misfold. And so you actually can have these accumulations over time, these aggregations of misfolded prion proteins that are not functioning. So what I wanted to be clear is that a prion protein is not necessarily bad. We all have prion proteins. When they misfold, if they misfold in a certain way, they can become these sort of infectious prion proteins that can then spread within the body. So they're not alive. You can't kill them. It's just a molecule. So that's one of the big challenges, is that the body can't mount any defense to them. So it's really hard to say come up with a vaccine because the body doesn't recognize it as foreign. We can't have an antibiotic to attack it because it's not a bacteria. It's a normally occurring protein. So to date, these CWD prions have only been found naturally occurring in cervids, so deer, elk, reindeer, moose, red deer. Anything else I'm forgetting?
Well, the different subspecies.
Okay, perfect. I'm not going to list the different subspecies for your fantastic audience
so
here.
Everyone in the West is going to ask antelope.
No
Not a
antelope, so-
cervid.
Not a cervid.
Not a cervid.
There you
Not
go,
a member of the
folks.
deer family. They are their own happy little
Right.
family. Antilocapridae. How adorable is that? So we have this, we believe to be a naturally occurring, or at least to date, we've only found it in members of the cervid family. When I talked about a little bit before that these individual proteins can contact each other and sort of accumulate, we know that these misfolded proteins can also be shed from individual animals, and that makes these animals contagious. So when I say it's being shed, I mean, your kid with a runny nose, that you don't want to get that snot all over your other kid. So you get these deer that are excessively salivating, drooling. They've got saliva. They've got mucus coming out of them. Feces, everybody poops, right? So we've been able to find these prions in feces. So that's one of the big concerns, is that these animals are shedding this contaminated material into the environment. Once it's in the environment, we know that it can retain some level of infectivity over time. The maximum amount of time is not known. There's one study I can think of out of Colorado, I think it was in mule deer, that actually looked at, they held some pastures fallow for 2 years, some pens fallow for 2 years, put naive, what are considered clean, uninfected animals back in there, and they came down positive up to 2 years after holding those pens open. So that was 2 years that these misfolded prions were in the environment, and they were able to infect new animals. So that's one of the big concerns. We don't know how long that could potentially last for. So you have these animals that are directly contagious. So anytime they have direct contact with another individual, they have the potential to infect that animal, as well as picking up from the environment. So obviously this is one of those diseases that over time, we really worry about the amount of this stuff that's being shed into the environment. There's also been some recent work done over the years looking at plant uptake, and we have been able to find that plants uptake proteins into their tissues. We know this. And some research was done with some of the more common plants, corn, wheat, tomatoes. Yeah, where these misfolded proteins were taken up actually through the roots and actually up into the aerial tissues, and they retained infectivity to animals that might have come and grazed on that. So that's one of the concerns looking at that. So a couple of the things, and I'm going to turn it over to Krysten here in a second, because I know I forget things all the time, which is, just one nature of my beast that I deal with. But one of the things that we know when we start talking about management of this disease is that if we do nothing, if we do not try to actively manage this disease, it will do two things. We know this. It will increase in prevalence, which means more animals will be infected over time, and it will increase in spread, or geographic distribution. So the area where we have positive animals will continue to grow. So those are the two things that I can tell you. I think we can be dang confident to say that if we do nothing, this will only increase in both the number of infected animals and the areas affected by it. So can you shed some more information on whatever I forgot? See, I ramble. This is the nature of.
Well, Kelly, while you were doing that, I'm like, I'm almost falling off my chair here. It's brought in by plants, even. It stays in the landscape for years.
So the plant studies were,
the plant studies, it's hard, right, to study things in the natural environment. So that was a laboratory study.
It was a laboratory,
One thing that we have done both in the lab and out on the landscape is looked at soils. So as Kelly mentioned, that these animals, not only does it take a long time for them to get sick and die with this, but during that time, within about the first 3 months after they get exposure, from another animal or from the environment to this misfolded prion, and they ingest that, 3 months later, they can be shedding this stuff. And so they're walking around on the landscape for a year or more, shedding prions. And then they die, and in their central nervous system, in their brain, and their spinal cord, and their lymph nodes, the prions are more concentrated, but that carcass is laying there, creating a hot spot on the ground for prions. And the weird thing about this new class of diseases, these prion diseases, is that they seem to bond with soil, and they prefer certain soil types because they have an ionic charge. So soil types that are found in clay, like montmorillite, they actually bind relatively tightly to, and they become more infectious. So a study just came out looking around mineral licks in natural environment in Wisconsin, and found prions in the soil there. So we were able to detect it in the environment, knowing that the environment is then contaminated. So it's a really challenging thing to study out on the landscape. So we do have to use a lot of laboratory methods, and we actually use transgenic mice, which is where they've taken deer or elk genes and stuck them into mice to act like little mini deer or elk because they're a lot easier to keep in the lab, and the experiments go a lot faster. Because, you're a researcher trying to do an experiment on CWD and having to wait years for that experiment to terminate and then publish the results of that. That's a long time, and it makes it really challenging. We are taking a lot of the information that we know about the environmental contamination from similar diseases, similar transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, which is the class of diseases that CWD falls in.
TSE is
TSE, correct.
If the audience hears TSE, that's the class of diseases.
Exactly. So transmissible, meaning it can go from animal to animal. Spongiform, basically because your brain looks like a sponge. Encephalopathy is disease of the brain. So scrapie is a prion disease in sheep, and so we've tried to accumulate knowledge from what's happened with scrapie to kind of inform CWD, because it is a relatively new disease that we're still in the process of learning about. CWD and scrapie seem to function very similarly, but the sort of bad wolf in the class of diseases that everybody knows about is bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or mad cow disease. And that's the one that really frightens people because it did go into humans as variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So that's where, in this class of diseases, there's some naturally occurring prion diseases in humans, both spontaneously and genetic, and even it can go iterogenic, which means like assisted on like medical equipment, essentially, because these prions are really difficult to destroy. Because they're not a bacteria or a virus, you can't kill them. So you have to heat them up at really high temperatures or use very harsh chemicals to denature the protein, to actually break down the protein.
Wow. You did say something that I want to highlight the importance of this. When we talk about a lot of the studies that are out there on CWD, we do use things, or researchers use things like mouse models, right? Or highly controlled laboratory studies. And so there isn't a lot, there are some, but there aren't a lot of publications out there yet that are really looking at more natural environments. So that is a limitation with some of our studies to date, is that they're more of what researchers would consider a proof of concept study. So like, let's make the worst possible conditions and see if we can make this happen. And then if so, that tells us, okay, that, now we can try to take the next step and do more studies. So I think there's a lot of criticisms out there of some of the studies because of that limitation, but I think it's important to point out why. We need studies that we can do ideally in a shorter time span than it would take to actually naturally infect these animals. You almost have to do these controlled studies first and see if it's possible. So, and today, most of I would say all of the research out there on this, at least force us to be cautious. Really, it really forces us to be cautious with what could come out. And you're laughing at me now.
Well, I'm laughing because this leads me to my precautionary principle, which I might as well get.
Let's hear it.
I didn't even know I had a segue.
This is my sort of bread and butter. I might as well get it tattooed somewhere because I say it a lot. But so Kelly mentioned proof of concept, and it's sort of the flip side of innocent until proven guilty. So the precautionary principle is basically like, we think this is bad. We are going to do everything we can to prevent it until we know that it's safe, which is the opposite of, this seems okay. We'll keep doing it until we know it's bad.
Yeah.
And especially with CWD, the science right now is telling us that this is bad. And we don't have all the answers yet. A lot of people are working really hard to try to get those, but it does take a very long time. And the time frame that science moves isn't fast enough for a lot of policy decisions to be made. So I think if we can look towards more of a precautionary principle in making these decisions and then let the science prove that it's fine. I mean, it's still out there. You still need to do the studies to answer these questions. But since all indications seem like this disease can be really devastating to a lot of things like hunting and then all the downstream activities that hunting produces, why can't we be cautious about it and then, err on the side of caution and be okay with it later on?
Yeah. Well, that almost seems too logical for today's world. Come on, Krysten. What are you thinking here now?
I know. I get in trouble for logic a lot. I know. I've already been accused of it in the past day for using common sense. Shame. I know.
Well, just listening to this last 10 or 15 minutes, the two of you explain this, my mind is almost hurting trying to absorb what the two of you have said as a brief overview. Because you said so much in that period of time of things I was not aware of. And I think I read a lot. I engage a lot in these topics. But I'm thinking, Randy, you've been concocting your own ideas on this, and you're like not even in kindergarten as far as information on this topic. But thanks for kind of rolling back to what the disease is. Krysten, you were talking about the science in the precautionary approach. Is there any science out there that has yet said, and maybe there is, but none of the science I've read says, oh, don't worry about this? I've heard a lot of political opinions. I've heard a lot of media opinions of, oh, don't worry about it. Is there any science that says this is nothing to worry about?
Well, I guess the short answer is I would say no, because that's not really how science works. We're trying to answer a question or a hypothesis, but there's always room for more. And right now, with the funding situation for CWD being what it is, it's very difficult to get funding to work on CWD. There's not a lot of federal dollars, and so states are trying to pony up, but they're usually strapped for cash, and unless they see this as a big priority, they might not support it as well. Some states are stepping up and doing a fantastic job, but there's a lot of differences across the country in how people approach it. And I think one of the challenges with CWD is that sometimes, especially like I'll use Arkansas as a case in point. They found it sort of out of the blue. They thought they were doing, a relatively good job with surveillance. All of a sudden, boom, they have CWD and a lot higher prevalence rate, more positives than they really expected they would ever have. And their deer biologist it gets dropped in his lap, and all of a sudden he has to become a CWD expert in the span of 2 days.
Wow.
And so states like Michigan, where they have a wildlife veterinarian, or other states that have a wildlife health specialist on staff that can kind of stay up to date on the science, because the deer biologist has tons of stuff to do. They have to answer hunters' questions,
Right.
all the time, and concerns. It's challenging for some of these states to get ramped up and to really be looking for this. And perhaps I'm going a little far afield here, but as far as the science, we have a lot of questions that we still need to be answered. And I think it's hard in a natural setting, and especially because in science we want sort of a control situation. And then you can compare your experimental treatment to the control and see if it works. But CWD, we don't always have that. Everybody wants us to do something right now. And I'm not saying
Right.
that we should, just let it burn out of control, but it just makes it hard to figure out what's working and what's not. So states like Wisconsin and Illinois have had sort of a dichotomous approach to it, where Illinois has been very active in sharpshooting. They've been able to maintain low prevalence levels. Granted, their ecosystem is a lot different. So
yeah.
It may not work for every situation. But I think as long as the encouragement is out there to manage it, to learn from it, to look at other states, like in New York, I look at Wisconsin quite a bit because their system, their deer herd, is more similar to New York than, say, Western states. So I think you have to take the best information available and assimilate it. And there's always going to be uncertainties, but you use the best judgment that you have.
Yeah, and I think to follow up on that a little bit too, I think working for a state that's, in the CWD battle right now, we've got, as of right now, 61 known cases of chronic wasting disease in Michigan. We're acknowledging, the state wildlife agencies are acknowledging, one, we're stretched thin. People are stretched thin.
Yeah.
They're asked to do 2 jobs, to be somebody they're not, to be an expert in something they're not familiar with. So we acknowledge that, but the good news, and I love to touch on, silver linings when I can, is that we're taking a regional approach. And I can speak for at least the Midwest. I'll touch a little bit on the West. I'm not as familiar in the Northeast or the Southeast, but the Midwest especially has a really active Midwest wildlife health group. So you have wildlife health representatives from all the state agencies, states in the Midwest, and we meet once a year, but otherwise we're in contact a lot. And I'm fortunate enough to chair that group right now. And so really trying to take a regional approach to this disease, because Krysten said something earlier. I mean, CWD does not care if you're in Wisconsin or Illinois or Michigan or Minnesota. Like, it does not care. So we're trying to do a regional approach. So amongst the wildlife health community, we're really trying to do that. We're also teaming up with our Midwest deer biologists, right? So we bring that expertise into it, and the deer population management and regulations and all the dynamics with those into these conversations. And we've had, we're having now weekly calls with all those folks, and we're doing some collaborative research projects are in the works to really try to understand. We need to take this on as a regional approach, because that way we can share resources. We're not all reinventing the wheel, trying to come up with fact sheets and outreach stuff and messaging and regulations. Like, we can help each other out. But what's really interesting too is the Western states have that too, and so a number of the Western states got together and released, and your listeners here can find this. It's available online, but they have it's called the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. They have a health committee, the WAFWA group, which I just think is a funny word, so I say it at every context. But they put together basically a management plan, a CWD management plan, right? And so it outlines sort of some of those adaptive management recommendations on how we can try to combat this disease. So I think that those are kind of the approaches that are really useful now.
We should mention there's an association of fish and wildlife agencies. So
Right.
Every state agency director goes to these meetings twice a year. And Kelly and I were co-authors on chapters in this document for best management practices.
Ooh.
And so that is coming up, should be released sometime, hopefully in the near future. So helping states that don't necessarily have, the resources to put into this, that they can kind of get the Cliff Notes version of how to best manage this disease. And maybe you can't go with the deluxe option that you would like. It's not palatable for your state or whatever, but it gives alternatives. And those chapters have been written by some of the best people out there that have been working on this disease for a long time. So I would encourage hunters to even look through that document to see all the options that are available. So maybe even if your state agency doesn't pass a ban on whole carcass imports, that you have to bring back your deer if you go out of state, deboned and all that, maybe you choose on your own to do that. If that's something that you can do, and if you don't know how, you can educate yourself on it, or if you shoot that trophy animal of a lifetime, you look in that state and you find a taxidermist that's darn good, and you take that animal to them in that proper area to take care of and get back. So you're doing it in the right way. And that's one thing that I think state agencies are really cognizant about, not limiting hunting opportunities, and they want people to bring back things that are important to them. And say you go somewhere and you get you're hunting in a CWD positive area, you get your animal tested, and the results come back that's positive, and you have venison sitting in the freezer, and you're like, what do I do with this? I personally handled cases this past year of hunters that went out of state. They brought back everything properly. They called the state agency and said, what do I do with it? And we said, we'll happily come get it and dispose of it for you properly, so that it's not going out on the landscape, creating a new hotspot of prion introduction.
Yeah. Like it's all these things. We're gonna. I can tell you right now, we're gonna run out of time because
we talk a lot. That's what you're saying.
No, because so many amazing topics. I might have to go to the next CWD conference to catch up to the two of you, and we'll do part 2. But before we turn down the mics, we were talking about what hunters can do and how, as hunters, the two of you do not want people to stop hunting because of this.
Not at all.
And how a lot of times hunters unknowingly are doing things that add or possibly increase the distribution and the prevalence of this. And when you were talking about that meat in the freezer, Krysten, I'm like, well, a lot of hunters might have just said, I'm going to go chuck this. I'm going to go feed it to a bear or something. Well,
go toss it in the back 40.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, guess what? Unknowingly, somebody has done something that contributes to the expansion and the prevalence of this. And so there's just so many things. You touched on another one, and these are just ones bouncing through my head. We did a YouTube video on our YouTube channel about boiling the skulls, doing European mounts out in the field before we head home. We were in Nevada. And I got a lot of comments and emails of people saying, why would you do that there? And it's because a lot of the Western states, and probably I suspect most states now, have adopted regulations that you cannot take cervids, at least if they have spinal tissue or brain matter, across state lines. I just operate from the premise that every state has that rule, and I get the Euro mount done, like you said, either by a taxidermist there, or if we've brought our trailer, we bring our big pots and our burners and our peroxide, and we do it right there. Because if it was to test positive, I want all the remains of that carcass to stay right in the same general area that animal was living, rather than haul it 100 miles or 800 miles somewhere else and create another hotspot. So
that's the thing. If you're dumping it in your back 40, you're creating a hotspot in probably what's your favorite hunting area.
On your property, right? So there's 2 things I want to say about that. So one, actually 3, because you brought up a really good point. You can. Honestly, think about, even if your state doesn't have a regulation restricting the importation of an intact carcass, cervid carcass that's harvested in another state, treat it like it does.
Right.
That would be a recommendation, right?
Yeah.
But so like you said, that was a good one. Also, one of the campaigns that came out of Michigan was, and I've heard it other places too, so I don't want to stake any claim here, but know before you go. So know the regulations of the state that you're hunting in, as well as your own state regs, right? So I live in Michigan. When I'm fortunate enough to save my pennies with 2 kids in daycare, I go and hunt in Northwest Colorado, which is a CWD endemic area. So what do I do as a hunter? Well, I read the Colorado regs book, right? But technically, do I have to read the Michigan regs book? No, I'm not hunting. If I'm not hunting in Michigan, no, I just have to read Colorado. Read them both. So know before you go. Know the regulations of the state you're going to, as well as your own state regs. And finally, there's a website called, or a group called the CWD Alliance, and they have a website. And on that website, it's CWD.info, or no, CWD dash, thank you, goodness, I'm screwing everybody up. CWD-info.org. That website has a big table on it, and that's actually put together by a couple of folks in my shop in Michigan. But this table updates twice a year all the regulations for each state when it comes to carcass movement, when it comes to the CWD status. Do they have CWD? If so, is it in captive deer, or is it in free-ranging deer, or both? So you can kind of get an idea of what's going on across the country. So regulations by state. So I think that's a really useful resource for people, or at least I hope it is. Otherwise, I'll take it off my staff to-do list. But no, they would like to lose that responsibility, but absolutely not. It's important to have that out there.
www.cwd-info. Slow people like me, I got to spell this out.
Well, and I'm northern Minnesota to the core, so I talk a little too fast. Otherwise, we freeze it up. So yes, you're right. Say it again, though.
.org. So cwd-info.org.
Yes.
And Krysten, you're talking about is that the same website you were referring to? Earlier, you were talking about.
I don't remember what website you were talking about.
Was I talking about a website?
I thought you were.
Okay.
I was gonna stop you and ask you what's the website, but anyhow, I was probably, I probably made up. Like I said, I'm good at BS.
Well,
so,
I mean, Dr. Google can tell you a lot of
Dr. Google
good things and bad.
Google is your friend for sure.
So here's
I know what it was. You were talking about best management practice.
Yes. Yep.
And so is that
that's not publicly available yet.
Oh,
so
okay.
The directors of the state agencies need to ratify it or bless it or sign off on it at this meeting coming up. So hopefully it will be available to the public soon. But I know that there are a lot of other non-government organizations out there that are really getting in sort of the CWD information campaign. And that's really what we need. You know, state agencies have been trying to do it, but I think if we can get these other groups out there to really let people know about CWD, because coming from different angles, but providing the same consistent message is really important. And, you know, I started studying CWD back in 2002 in South Dakota, and I was really into the biology. I was catching deer with helicopters. I was taking live samples then for research purposes and chasing them around and just really focused on what happens to the deer on the ground. And in the evolution of my work on this disease, I've come at it from economic perspectives and now the social perspectives. So it's one thing that we've been looking at is a lot of the messaging around CWD, and hunters really respect organizations that they feel are similar to them. And so I think that now that these organizations are really saying CWD is a problem, I am very hopeful, and that's why I'm here in Bozeman, that hunters will say, hey, you know, I'm getting this message from all these organizations that I believe in, I've been a member of for a long time, and they're saying it's an issue and that I can do something about it, and maybe that will spark people to take action, because it's inconvenient. And we know it's inconvenient. You know, I grew up on the border of Pennsylvania and New York, and we didn't think anything about crossing that border. It was like it was a non-entity.
Right.
And so, you know, having to debone a deer now before you drive 6 miles across the border is a hassle, and we get that. But this is all about the bigger picture, and it's long-term. So sort of the short-term inconvenience for what could be a huge problem in a few decades is what we're talking about.
Yeah. So that gets me to 2 questions, and either of you can answer however you want or in whatever way you want. I always put myself, if I'm trying to convince an audience that this is important to them, I ask the question, why should I care? Why should they care? And some people listening are probably like, I hear all these kind of fear-mongering worries. My life's so complicated. I got enough to worry about, And then once you get them to, okay, I do care. What can I do? What should I be doing? How do I can't solve this problem, but how do I not make it worse?
So one of the things I think we've already kind of hammered on the carcass movement stuff, right? And I continue to hammer on that because we do know it's a very likely source of risk for this disease. So we hammer on carcass movement, but let's say you're hunting on your own property, right? And you shoot a deer. Well, what recommendation should I follow? Whether or not I'm in a CWD area, what should I follow? And and so if you ever want to absolutely have a room full of people stare at you like you are a fantastic idiot, you should stand up in front of a room full of hunters in northern Michigan, and you should tell them that after they get done harvesting their animal and when they are done field dressing, they should bury the the entrails. So bury basically everything you yank out of the body cavity. And I said this in a room, and you should have seen their faces because, nobody needs to remind me what the weather is like in northern Michigan.
In November.
In November to December. And so I said, bury it, like dig a hole and bury it. And they just looked at me like I have no idea what I'm talking about, which is, endearing. But no, so I only own 8 acres of property, but, we do have deer passing through and we will hunt our property. We just bought it this year, so we will be hunting it. And I will have a hole dug before fall. I will have a hole dug so that I can go and bury my carcass remains on the landscape right there. So that's one of those things. If you do have that available, great. Look and see what resources your state agency might have. I know a lot of states, especially Michigan does it, Wisconsin does it, has dumpsters available for people at deer check stations, so you can actually dispose of your carcasses there, and they can make sure they're properly disposed of. Check your state agency, wildlife agency website for any resources they have for carcass handling, carcass disposal instructions. And if they don't have any, give them a call and ask, and see what they know. But we really need to sort of have a little bit of a culture shift with how we're handling material, especially in a CWD area. So is there anything else you want to add to that, or anything else you can think of?
Well, so one of the things that we did recently in New York was put together a risk minimization plan.
Okay.
And with that, we brought a team of biologists and veterinarians, myself and other colleagues from Cornell, together to talk about what are all the risk factors. Because, sometimes people say, oh, you're just going after the low-hanging fruit. You're trying to stop hunting or things like that. No, we wanted to address it very comprehensively and wrap our arms around the whole issue. And so, obviously, carcass imports was a big thing in that, and it was sort of broken down into introducing the disease into the state and how you could do that, and then spreading it around the state. And some of these things are not popular. They're things that hunters like to do, but if they know that there is risks associated with how they're disposing of carcasses, even if it's a local carcass. I actually talked to landfill owners and said, hey, are you okay with hunters putting carcass waste in the trash? And they said, yeah, that's fine. They can do that. And so that, that might vary state to state, but those are the things that you can find out by talking to your local owners. Other things that are popular, like use of natural deer urine. And I did a survey with the National Deer Alliance and asked hunters, what do you think about CWD risks and natural deer urine? And they said, yeah, 4 out of 5 hunters have used it, some of the time, most of the time. But they said if it's a CWD risk, go ahead and ban it. I'm going to stop. And if you think about it, these risks might be infinitesimally small. Yeah. But it's the accumulation over time. If you think about all the hunters out there, right, or even what you do on your own property, again, going back to, you could be creating a hotspot. If you are a religious deer urine user, you're pouring that on the ground year after year. It might only be a few ounces, but that's where we get back to the precautionary principle until we know that something's safe. And there are synthetic alternatives out there. If this is something you really think is important to your hunt, then, there are hopefully alternatives that you can use.
Yeah.
Other things that we talk about in general, if you're in a CWD positive area, you probably want to get that animal tested before you eat it.
I'm glad you brought that up, Krysten, because one of the questions I wrote down is, should we all get our game tested if we hunt in a CWD positive area?
It's a tough one to answer because the deer might not look sick.
Right.
Like I said, I chased deer around for years and watched them almost on a daily basis. So I could see, if one ear was drooping. A lot of these I could not tell. They might get killed by a car or by a coyote or, shot outside of the area that I was working and come back CWD positive, and there was no tell. And I was out there glassing them every day, seeing it, like specifically looking to see if I could see something. So I think going back to your question about testing, in these endemic areas, the possibility of getting a CWD positive is generally pretty small. The prevalence rates in some areas, in most areas, there's a few where the prevalence rates are going up, and you can find that information generally online, what your odds are sort of shooting a positive deer.
Yeah.
Generally pretty low. But if you are at all concerned about it, I would say get it tested. And if it's positive, the Center for Disease Control recommends that you do not consume that animal. And that language has changed. They recently changed that because of a study that was done on macaques, which are a monkey species.
Okay.
And those are the most similar primate species that you can do research on in a captive setting to humans.
Okay.
And there's been a few studies on different primate species. So there was a previous one done on macaques that looked like they couldn't get CWD. Squirrel monkeys, it looked like they could. These are very small sample sizes because the studies are hugely expensive and very time consuming to do. There's a study with researchers out of Canada looking at consumption of skeletal muscles, so the venison that we would eat, and also consumption of brain material. And a few animals in the study showed up with CWD detected in their brain when they died. And the study is still ongoing. There's still a few animals that are alive, so it hasn't been published yet. So we have sort of conflicting evidence. And again, not a whole lot of evidence, but I think we shouldn't shut the door that it's a possibility, and going back to being very safe and the precautionary principle with this. I mean, I would much rather have an animal tested, and we should definitely say that the CWD tests that we do right now are not a food safety test. So what you'll get back if you get your animal tested is that either CWD was detected and that animal is positive, or it was not detected. And we can't say that it's negative. We can just say that we did not find the prions in that animal. Because like I mentioned at the very beginning, it takes a few months for that animal to actually start shedding prions and for prions to show up in the tissues that we test, where they build up to a level like Kelly was talking about. It takes a while, when one abnormal one causes another one to become abnormal, and it kind of rockets up from there, but it takes a little bit. So we can't tell you that animal is safe to eat. That's a decision you have to make on your own for you and your family.
I had a friend who hunted just outside of Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, Unit 20, shot a bull elk. All indicators were, wow, great.
Fantastic,
yeah.
Great wall hanging.
Yeah, and he had it tested, and he lives in Minnesota. He gets a call, hey, or email, or I don't know how they contacted him. Jim, your elk tested positive for CWD. And so he contacted the Minnesota DNR about how to properly dispose of that. And even before, this was quite a few years ago. Well, I hunt central Wyoming a lot. Very high endemic rate for CWD, especially at least in the studies I've talked to their biologists, in mule deer. Very high rate there. Not quite as high in elk. But I've taken 3 elk out of that area. I've never got any of them tested.
Okay.
And I'm like, oh, gee, Randy. No wonder you're slow.
Nobody wants to be the first human
Nobody
case of
wants to be that guinea
CWD.
pig, no.
But maybe we'll call it Newberg disease.
There you go.
One thing I do want to say about getting your animal tested, especially depending on where your listeners are, if hunters can do a favor and try to reach out to the State Wildlife Agency, check on the website, see if the agency or the biologists are trying to do active surveillance in an area, please get that animal tested. So our situation in Michigan right now is, we found a lot of positives in a short period of time last winter, and it was very scary. In that one season, one firearm season, we literally found an entire sort of pocket of disease that we did not know was there. So my focus this year is really to ramp up our surveillance around there. Now, we're not making it mandatory, and that is one of those hard things to try to communicate to people. I like to really push messaging and education and try to ask people to help us rather than making a regulation. Right. But it's a toss-up. There's pros and cons both ways. So we decided to not go mandatory this year, which I think will allow us a little more flexibility with our surveillance. But I really am hoping that everybody that harvests, we're really asking people that harvest, especially outside of where we know we have the disease, I want to know how widespread it is. Yeah. So I'm really asking every hunting group I talk to, please, if you hunt in these kind of townships, please submit a testing. Please submit a sample for us so we can better gain an understanding of where this disease is in the landscape. Every state's got their different sort of goals with surveillance, and every state's got their own resources that they can devote to something like this. But especially if you are in a state that is actively trying to look for the disease in an area and you hunt in that area, please help out the agency. So it'll help us all in the long run better understand the distribution of this disease.
So that certainly falls in the what can I do category. If you're listening and you hunt in a state that has a testing program going on, please, if you harvest an animal, participate in that process. If we as hunters want to say we are the conservationists, it requires a little bit more than just buying your hunting license.
Which we are, right? I mean, sportsmen are, and sportswomen, thank you. Yeah. Sportsmen are the original conservationists. Right. We are. I mean, that's I have the bumper sticker, folks. And so it's kind of one of those things where it's about time we start showing it.
Yeah. So I'm going to get into a stickier issue here.
No fun.
Yeah. And it gets to the topic about interstate transfer, or maybe it's intrastate. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be across state lines. And I'll take responsibility for opening up the can of worms here. But there are captive cervid operations that buy and sell live animals all the time. And I don't. You have now informed me that what I've learned in the last hour tells me I better keep my mouth shut anytime I talk about CWD. But prior to becoming more enlightened in the last hour, I've read so much that says that captive cervid operations have shown to be places where CWD has a higher prevalence than in natural settings. Is that safe to say?
Well, I think that when we talk about different things, we don't want to get into a finger pointing situation. Right. And so I think in the past it's been easy to say, oh, it's captive cervids, and right. Hunters don't kind of not shirk, yeah. But they're not as willing to maybe take responsibility. Right. And as far as, the risks associated with captive cervids, I think that, this is a disease that affects them too. Right. And people spend a lot of money getting their animals, putting up fences, investing in this operation. And if they find the disease on their facility, it can potentially be devastating. Right. And there is a program in USDA to pay indemnity, because it's essentially the government taking their animals if they depopulate, which is the goal. You want to get those animals off the landscape as quickly as possible, so there's no escapes, there's no prions, floating downstream after that animal pees, right. Or anything. Those prions are contained in that facility. And with the captive cervid operations, a lot of their business model is built around movement of animals.
That's where I was going with that.
But what we've seen in New York, because our Department of Agriculture and Markets recognized that a lot of the animals coming in, the live captive cervids were coming in from states like Pennsylvania that found CWD in captive cervids in 2012. They were coming in from states like Wisconsin that's had CWD for a long time. That we had a really high risk from those operations because there's so much movement and it's very difficult to trace.
Right.
And we've asked the USDA to do these epidemiological tracebacks, and it can look like a spider web. So it's challenging for their personnel to get that done. So the Department of Agriculture and Markets said, okay, we're going to have a 5-year ban on live captive cervids coming into New York until we can sort of get this sorted out. It's not sorted out yet. We still have some issues, and the USDA keeps working on their herd certification program to try to improve it. They should be coming out with new program standards soon. But what we've seen in New York, at least, is that the value of those animals on those facilities has gone up so much because people feel more confident that those animals do not have CWD because of the regulations that are in place.
In New York.
In New York. And
Yeah.
Texas is actually very similar, where they had a ban on live captive cervids coming into the state before they ever found CWD. So that just goes to show you that, Texas is the biggest captive cervid operation in the country,
Right.
that it's not a complete killer for the industry.
Yeah.
So I think the more captive cervid owners that really take their biosecurity, because it's their investment seriously, the better off they are.
Yeah.
And it's just really tough to figure out where these animals have gone. It takes a lot of time, and that allows the disease to move faster than we can keep up with it. When a deer or elk's moving down the highway at 75 miles an hour, that's faster than the wild deer is going to move, even though we hear about, some long distance movements.
Right.
It's still, people are moving stuff a lot faster than the natural movement of the disease would occur.
Yeah. And I think a statement or a question you raised earlier of the high prevalence, the high amount of disease that has been found on some captive cervid operations is true. Upon depopulation, as Krysten mentioned, when some of these facilities have been depopulated over the years because of the detection of CWD, we have found very high prevalence rates. A high number of animals have been infected. 60 to 80% of animals have been positive from those facilities. But it's not across the board, right? And I never want to point fingers at anybody. And I think it boils down to, within these types of operations, what kind of surveillance is being done. Mm-hmm. And you will hear it said time and time again, and it's true. There's a lot of testing going on in the captive cervid industry for CWD. There's a lot of testing. There's a lot of folks doing a lot of things. Mm-hmm.
But just like we were talking about the food safety test, and, it's not CWD negative. That falls true for the captive cervid situation as well. Nobody can really say they're CWD free or they're CWD negative. They might be at a lower risk because they're participating in programs where they test any mortalities on their facility, but it's not a zero-sum game. So we just have to keep that in mind.
And that's getting to the movement stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So you can never really move an animal and say that it's CWD free. You can't. Yeah. We can't. We're not at the point that we can say that. But there are also facilities that aren't required to do testing.
Exactly.
Because of the fact that they are looked at least from the industry standpoint, as a dead-end facility, right? Because that animal is not going to be leaving that facility alive.
Right.
So therefore, the states can dictate. It depends on who's got the authority to require some testing. So some facilities have to test, but in some of these, they call them shooter facilities, right? Where people go and they go to
high fence shooting operations.
Sure. So depending on what state you're in, there might be some variations in whether or not those animals have to be tested.
Right.
And so what I would do is encourage people to find out in your state, what are those regulations? What are the testing requirements? What kind of surveillance is being done? Because guess what? Those aren't dead-end facilities for the proteins.
Right.
If they exist there, if prions exist in that herd, in that facility, and there's no testing, those prions, as I mentioned at the beginning of this whole podcast, are going to build up over time. And that's an environment. This is a living thing. And whether or not you're double fenced, triple fenced, quadruple fenced, things can leave in and out of those facilities. Gates can be left open, and I never want to blame anybody, but things can happen.
Right.
And this disease will win, and that sucks. So let's acknowledge this. And so I encourage people, find out what's going on in your state. What kind of testing is happening? Don't blame anybody, but just find out and contact your elected officials and say, hey, this concerns me. Or maybe it doesn't, fine. But if it does, find out what we can do.
Well, I think that's a really important point that, we kind of deal with the disease and sort of inside the fence and then outside the fence.
Right.
So if it's inside the fence, a lot of times the agriculture department is dealing with it in that state and it impacts the owner. They have indemnity money to pay for it. But some of these operations, especially if they're really big, are choosing not to take that indemnity and to continually operate. And they might put up a second fence, but that still is a huge risk factor out there. And that indemnity money comes from USDA, so that's taxpayer money. If it gets outside the fence, then we're talking about, the conservation fund type money or license sales
state
or state
PR,
agency dollars.
Probably not PR, but state agency dollars.
Are going then to fight that disease. And this isn't insignificant amounts of money that we're talking about either.
You look at what states like Wisconsin, what they have invested in CWD management. If you could have used that money for something else, we're talking, not insignificant amounts by any stretch. And where I was going with that question is a lot of my audience, pretty much all of my audience, look at the outside the fence situation. And they think all of this is governed, managed, implemented by their state wildlife agencies. In most states I'm familiar with, most of the captive cervid operation wants to be managed by state departments of agriculture, which have a completely different set of rules. They look at a lot of issues through a different lens. The dynamics of captive herds versus wild herds are completely different. The cost shifting of problems is completely different. So I want my audience to understand just what you pointed out, Krysten, that there is the inside the fence and the outside the fence. And if the inside the fence, the captives, the high fence operators, whatever you want to call it, are allowed by agency rules of Department of Livestock or their State Department of Agriculture to be moving these across the landscape, but the State Wildlife Agency says, no, you can't do that, you don't necessarily have best management practices going on everywhere.
It's tough, right? Because there's different mission statements with those agencies,
right.
And there was a case recently that just went through the Missouri Supreme Court that actually did turn the regulating authority of the captive cervid industry over to the Conservation Department. It was a long, ongoing legal battle there. And so, but you're right. I think most states, you can see have sort of a split jurisdiction where maybe the State Wildlife Agency has some authority over the fencing or over some sort of annual inspections or something. But for most states, not across the board, but most states, the health requirements, the testing stuff is going to be overseen by the Department of Agriculture.
Yeah. And this is for my audience that you go down a little rabbit hole here, and the two of you are not responsible for this commentary, but
Okay.
When these debates happen, at least in the hunting world, the captive cervid operation, they get very frustrated that people like me and most others don't really recognize shooting animals, captive animals in a pen as quote unquote our idea of hunting. And these groups will say, this is hunting, this, da. But they are fighting with all their might and all their money and all their political influence to make sure that they are governed by a Department of Agriculture within their state. And I know a lot of you listening are like, you can't have it both ways. If you want to call yourself hunting, you need to make yourself subject to oversight of a game agency. If you want to call yourself, or if you want oversight from your ag agency, fine. Don't try to call yourself hunting. We don't go there and shoot our chickens like we shoot grouse. We don't go there and shoot pigs and cows like we shoot deer and elk. And so the reason I interject that is I know a bunch of the audience who's listening is driving down the road or listening saying, Newberg, why aren't you bringing that up? It's obvious as the nose on your face. Well, there, folks, I brought it up. But the two of you, I like your point of let's not focus on blame. Let's figure out how we manage it and what we do. And that's definitely going to get us further down the road. I think my audience, though, if we have lack of compliance in one place and everyone else either complying or volunteering in the other place, it causes them to say, well, why am I even doing this?
What's the point?
Yeah. Why me? I'm willing to do this, but damn it, get the rest of the people on board somehow. And I don't know where you solve that problem other than I go to an awful lot of state legislatures. I get drawn into a lot of this stuff. And it's at this point where the intersection of science intersects with the science of politics and the science of finance and economics, which I guess that's really a society like we have scientists like the two of you who look at information, create data, create valuable research that policymakers have to make the judgments of what's the science telling us versus what's the benefits or the costs out here in the, as they call it, the real world. All of you probably have more of a real world than they do, but I promise, folks, I'm not going to pick on any single politician on this podcast today. So you can save your email strokes of telling me what a communist, whatever I am today. But best management practices, because I've held you long and I know that you guys have to be at another place in, 20 minutes or so. What would be the quick list of best management practices that my audience, these people listening, could be doing? We talked about carcass disposal. We talked about getting their animals tested. Are there other things that people can be doing? Hunters.
Number one.
Yeah.
Keep hunting.
Oh, okay. That's great
Why
to
do you
hear.
sound surprised? Why was that? Okay.
Because the reason I sound surprised is every headline you read,
I know.
Every discussion you hear about CWD is the sky is falling. You're on this terminal path. You're exposing yourself to all these risks. It becomes this cumulative feeling that CWD should cause me to almost just give up on this and take up shuffleboard or something. So,
well, we're sure you'd be good at shuffleboard.
That's in your future, apparently.
I completely agree with Kelly that we need people hunting. We need the population management. Hunters are our best tool for that. And with this disease, we know that it's transmitted animal to animal, so they have to come in contact with either another infected animal or a contaminated environment. And if you have populations just exploding out of control, that disease is going to go much faster through that population. And I actually got asked this question by a reporter in a suburban situation where the deer are way overpopulated. And they said, well, wouldn't CWD actually help us? Because then it would knock the deer population down. And I don't know if they thought it through, that they're going to have deer tipping over on their front lawns. And It's not pretty. I mean, I've seen end stage CWD, and it's a horrible, horrible way for these animals to go. So I would much rather have a hunter out there and have them take that animal, use that animal, if it's a non-detect, and enjoy the experience, contribute, their dollars to their state agencies. And that's a huge thing that they can do. I think taking an interest, in addition to all the other things that we've already talked about, taking an interest in it and letting their wildlife agency know that it's important to them, because we've got some other people that are making a whole lot of noise, and the hunting public is relatively quiet on this issue. When we did the risk minimization plan that I mentioned, we got hundreds of comments, but the proportion that were from hunters was relatively small.
Really?
And we did get some really good support from hunters saying, hey, this is important. I am glad you guys are doing this. But it takes a lot to sort of overwhelm the shouting from the naysayers. And I think that the power that the hunting public has, there's millions of hunters out there. And if that can be a voice to say, we're really taking this seriously and we think it's important and you should do something about it, that sends a much stronger message than Kelly or I trying to go to the agency and saying, hey, this is important. And they're like, of course you do. Yeah. This is what you spend a lot of your time working on. You've got CWD on the brain, which,
Right.
I can't agree more. We haven't slept since 2002. And so that's
why thankfully it's a podcast and they can't tell.
You guys can't see this as you're listening, but basically most of this podcast has just been Krysten and myself staring off like blindly, blankly in the room because we don't have our children with us, so we can actually just kind of check out. But no, we really have been, I think, really doing the best we can, and a lot of people have fighting this disease, but Krysten's absolutely right. We need more voices out there. There's very, very strong, high-level political arguments that this isn't a real threat and that this is all being overblown. And I cannot encourage people enough to get involved, please, because we definitely need support.
Yeah, I'll just throw these examples out there. A lot of people know how involved I am with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. The Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation was lucky to work with some really good state agencies east of the Mississippi to reintroduce elk to places like Kentucky and Missouri and Arkansas and Wisconsin and West Virginia and Pennsylvania and Tennessee and North Carolina. We at those of us elk advocates, we've almost been told, expect CWD to stop the process of reintroducing elk in the East. That affects a lot of people. Think if Kentucky, which is kind of for me, the shining example of 10,000 elk east of the Mississippi, I would have never dreamt that. But in today's world, I doubt at the level of CWD we have, if we suggested that proposal for Kentucky today, if it would be allowed. There'd be so much resistance because of disease concerns, which Kentucky became the source for West Virginia, the source for North Carolina, the source for a lot of the Wisconsin elk. All of a sudden, that affects a lot of people who get a chance to hunt elk. And whether it's elk, whether it's deer, whatever it could be, I talk to the biologists in Wyoming and they tell me the struggles they have of bringing back their mule deer herds in and maybe you can comment on this, but what they've told me is the prevalence and the effect on the mature buck population is significant, where they almost cannot be restrictive enough in hunter harvest to do anything to help the age class of these buck mule deer. That affects a lot of people. That used to be one of the just great places to go hunt mule deer, not just for residents, but non-residents. So some people, it's been a gradual effect where it's just like, well, that's how it is. If you measured it from 2018 back to 1988, before this really was as demonstrated as it is, if that change happened in just the course of one season, people would be marching on the Wyoming Capitol with knives and pitchforks. My point of that is to follow up with what both of you have said. We have to get engaged. We have to get active as the hunting community, because if you don't show up and tell your story, someone else is telling their story or a different story, or worse yet, they're telling your story for you in a way that is never going to be good for you. And I know a lot of the listeners are thinking, well, I'm so busy, I'm so overwhelmed. And yes, we are. But we have organizations that can represent you. I would bet just about all of my listeners belong to one of the species organizations, one of the hunter conservation organizations. Bring that to them and let them know how important this is to you, because they have people, they have staff, they have infrastructure in place to go and speak on your behalf at state legislatures in Washington, D.C., in other places. And so I don't want the audience to think, oh, here's one more thing I got to go fight the world on all by myself. it doesn't have to be that way. For me, the other thing, and this is a frustration I have in a lot of the topics in the hunting world, is we tend to, thinking of how I say this politely, but we tend to discount things because it's inconvenient. And that becomes a good excuse not to be engaged. Well, I heard so-and-so say that some of this is just made up. Or, there's really no proof of this or whatever. And so it almost becomes a reason to not be engaged. Approach this with an open mind. Consume, I think one of you said, become informed. Consume as much information about this as you can. And know that it's going to affect you if you are a hunter. It's now endemic in 25 states?
Well, it's been detected in 25 states. In New York, we like to say that we're the only state to have, not found it after the initial detection, but we might be a special case.
Okay. She's in a club of one.
I know. Okay. I'm hanging on to that with my fingernails.
Yeah.
So.
Well, just here in Montana, this last hunting season, we had a depopulation effort south of Billings because it was detected. And then they did it. They're thinking, it's more prevalent than we thought. We are next to Yellowstone National Park. We have an elk herd in Yellowstone that has a lot of mixing of elk from Wyoming that is definitely a CWD positive location. It's not like they come into Yellowstone and the Wyoming elk say, whoop, hold on, we're going to stop right here because we don't want to mingle with these Montana elk. Sooner or later, we in Montana are going to have this problem. And I use that as an example that even if you are in a state that currently is considered exempt from the CWD issue, the odds are that's probably not going to stay that way forever. You look at Canada and the provincial arguments that you're having between Saskatchewan and Alberta, and when I talk to my Canadian friends, there seems to be a lot of finger pointing going on in Canada about this, which I always wonder, why do I never hear about it in Mexico? Has it not been detected in Mexico?
Nope, not in Mexico yet.
Really?
I don't. To be honest, I don't know how much
surveillance.
I don't know how much testing is going on down there.
Yeah, that's the challenge.
I guess if you don't test, you're never going to have a positive, right?
Yeah, but we want to make sure that we don't adopt sort of a fatalist attitude that it's going to be everywhere.
Or that it already is.
Yeah, eventually. Because I think we have, a relatively good handle based on the surveillance that's been done where we think it is. And granted, there's going to be new sparks showing up. But if we can kind of snuff out those sparks before it becomes a raging inferno, that's really your best bet for management. Trying to do something after it's already really going is more challenging. And that's why I keep coming back to the prevention. For the agency, it's the most cost-effective method that we have. It costs a lot less to do, even though it's inconvenient right now, in the long run, we're going to save money and we're going to save ourselves a lot of headaches because CWD is not a fun disease to deal with. And it's challenging for the hunters. It's challenging for the agency. It's potentially challenging for the public at large too.
Yeah.
One of the things we talk, and you've said it too, and we've said it multiple times here so far, is that we want people to get informed, right? And we want them to learn everything. But let's be honest, the interwebs have a lot of information that is not exactly what I would consider trustworthy nor sound. And so where do people turn, right? What do you read? What am I supposed to read? There's 1,000 CWD websites out there. Trust me, don't go to them. But except for the CWD info one we mentioned earlier. But so where do you start? Where do you start? And your state wildlife agency is going to have information. They will have information, but I understand that I come from that side of things, and so there's always criticisms there too. So there are a lot of papers. So we read publications, scientific publications, because we have no lives, and this is what we do pretty much every day.
Kelly, don't sell us out.
Seriously, I know I'm telling too many secrets here, but there was a paper that was written in 2016, and I bring it up because in spite of the multitude of stuff that Krysten and I both read and try to stay on top of, a lot of it's really technical, right? Nobody really enjoys that as much as we do. So there was a paper in 2016 that was written by Dr. John Fisher and Dr. Mike Miller, and it was about lessons learned about CWD. And It's a relatively easy read. I think it was very well written. It has a lot of really good information.
And it's not that long.
It's not that long. I want to say it was like 3 pages or something like that. You can sit down and just read it, right, with a cup of coffee.
So
and
with
it's a
Google,
good resource.
you would Google
with Dr. Google. So ask Dr. Google for a paper in 2016 called Lessons Learned.
CWD.
Yep, by Dr. Fisher and Dr. Miller.
Okay.
And so I'm sure you can find it, honestly. And so and if you can't get a hold of me, Randy's got my contact stuff. So, but either way, it's a great overview, I think, of kind of the breadth of the situation that we're in, and it's a good starting point resource, I would think, for folks that are kind of interested in this, don't want to get too technical, but yet want to have some comfort with these discussions.
Yeah. Well, there's just a lot more. I suspect 10 years from now, the two of you will look back and say, man, we know so much more now than we did 10 years ago, because you're probably saying today we know so much more now than we did 10 years ago.
Yep.
But I think one of you said there's never too much science.
Mm-hmm. And I think
there's room for more.
Yeah, one of the things that sometimes we hear about, is, we don't know enough. We need more research. And I completely agree with that statement. But Kelly and I have said this before. We kind of know enough at this point that CWD is serious. And we need to start taking it seriously. And we'll keep doing the research. I mean, I, in particular, love to have somebody go, well, we don't know how many live captive cervids are coming into the state. And like, okay, I'll go talk to the ag agency.
Let's find out.
Run the numbers and we'll answer the question. Or, what can hunters dispose of carcasses in the landfill? I'll call the landfill owners and talk to them and figure it out. And I think there's lots of people like that all across the country that are trying to fill in these information gaps and trying to get that information out to hunters. And we're just going to keep churning away. And because we care about the resource too. So it's science, and we're stepping our toes into advocacy because it's something that we care about too.
Yeah. Well, if there's one thing I've noticed in the last year is there's actually efforts in DC to create a funding mechanism for state agencies for CWD research.
Yep.
Now, whether or not that will get passed and funded, I guess, is yet to be determined. But another thing any of you can do is contact your senator, U.S. senator, or your U.S. congressperson and say, hey, bills that relate to funding of CWD research are something I would like you to support. And I should have the Capitol switchboard memorized. I call it way too often. But anyhow, Google is your friend. U.S. Capitol switchboard 202. Anyhow, that's how you can get a hold of your senator or your congressperson.
Yeah, I think Senator Tester is one of the co-sponsors of the bill. And then there's a companion one in the House. And having lived through a lot of other diseases like avian influenza and white nose syndrome, Congress sees these as issues and the funding goes up and then it comes down. Yeah. And that doesn't allow agencies to build capacity in those areas. And so same thing happened with CWD. It showed up, there was funding, and a lot of states ramped up their testing, and then that federal funding went away, and a lot of the testing sort of fell off. And so that's where we sort of need consistency in these areas to make sure that we can do the best job possible in disease surveillance, management, and prevention activities.
And not just for surveillance management too, but research. There's a bill, House Resolution 6272 was introduced from a representative from Louisiana. He was a senator from Louisiana. Representative House, there it is, from Louisiana. And 6272 is basically trying to get like the National Academy of Sciences to do research into CWD to basically fill some of those information gaps. Yeah. So all of that is very important. So not only surveillance and management and research, across the board, we need help. So,
well, this podcast has been heavy on the information side, and I can't thank the two of you enough, because I'm probably going to follow this up with a podcast that's going to be more policy, politics, and, it'll be a little more unfiltered. This has felt very filtered, not filtered. This just has really been learning for me. I really appreciate it. I hope that you don't find me a nuisance when I'm emailing and calling follow-up stuff, because
Not at all.
this audience sends so many questions to me, and I'm just going to put my hands up in there and say, I have no idea, but I'll try to find out. And I can't think of two better people that I could try to find out from than both of you. And so
I think we're happy to be that resource, right? I mean, it's ultimately, we're all kind of in this together, and I feel like I'm now existing off these like weird little slogans, like we're in this together. Like I need a poster of myself, like, punching the air and rallying the troops. But no, I mean, it's high time that we need to work a little bit better together, everybody.
Yeah.
And let's try to do something here.
Yeah, it's going to take the village to really get after this and make a big difference.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing. Like, I mean, I've been studying this disease for decades, and I haven't given up hope yet.
Yeah.
I haven't thrown in the towel.
She's still hunting.
Yeah, that I was just going to say that, Kelly.
Darn right.
Folks, you need to understand, these two spend their daily lives in this research and management of this disease, and they both continue to hunt. If there's any takeaway from this podcast, it's that two people as experts as you are in something like this continue to hunt. So please, don't quit hunting because you got CWD somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to Colorado this year. I'm going to Wyoming this year. I know those are both CWD positive areas. I am going to get my animals tested.
There it is.
There you go.
The culture shift has started.
We got one. It only took us an hour and a half, but we got one.
Yeah, you got one convert.
We should take the show on the road.
Yeah. But if I end up with a funky test result, I'll be sending it to you saying, what does this mean? Are these flaky, and what's the term I use?
Flaky
protein. So it sounds like a breakfast.
It does. I was just going to say that.
Breakfast
Sugar coated.
Yeah. Now with extra sugar. Now with extra flake.
Well, Kelly, Krysten, I can't thank you enough, both for your professional research, the way that you approach this, and for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to me and my audience today.
Of course.
We're happy to do it.
It was great to do it. Thank you.
Great. Well, there will be a follow-up sometime down the road. After I do this advocacy one and all these people get mad at me, I'll probably invite you back on the podcast to calm the restlessness.
Well, there's so much more to talk about. I mean, like you say, you can only scratch the surface in the amount of time that we have, but for people to hear about it, and you don't have to be an expert in this stuff, but just kind of know the basics and know what you can do, and that'll be doing a lot.
Yeah. Well, folks, thanks for listening. It is hunting season. I hope that you are out there hunting, because not tomorrow, but the next day, I will be. And I already have been. I'm embarrassed. Well, the audience already knows the prior two podcasts to this. I was on a blacktail hunt in Alaska.
I'm starting to question my life choices. I will be at work when he's hunting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
that's
fantastic.
I'm sorry, it's not a job. I've tried to convince so many people what I do is a job. To this day, the only person convinced is my wife.
How did you convince her? That's pretty
well,
good.
and Krysten, I haven't completely convinced her because she believes that a job includes a paycheck.
Oh, yeah.
And I've been doing this for 11 years now, and I've not got a paycheck. But I keep telling her someday, and she is an unbelievable wife. I married so far up the ladder. I didn't even know the ladder was that tall either. I think it's mostly because she's that high up and I started that far down. But
I think maybe she just wants you out of the house.
That's the other part.
You should go to work.
It's going to be our 30th wedding anniversary in February, and people normally we do. I didn't warn you. We normally do marital advice on this podcast.
Oh, you don't want that from us. This
Really?
is a disaster. Are you kidding me?
Parenting advice, marital advice from us? Sure.
That
we are
would
both
be
very happily
helpful.
married, but it would be comical. Yeah.
Well, that's usually where we get into the humor section of this podcast, is when I start giving marital advice. So I promised my wife I'd scale back on the marital advice on the podcast, but we just about went there.
We did. It was a rabbit hole. You opened it.
I know, but
and then we skirted away.
You said about me being gone that she just wants me to be gone. Well, that's why we are able to almost we're months away from our our 30th wedding anniversary because I am gone.
Well,
as much as I
congratulations.
am.
Yes, congratulations
Yes,
to you.
yes.
That's
Way
quite
to
a
find
feat.
that balance. Yes.
Yeah. Hopefully, I'll stay gone for the most of the next 3 months, 4 months. Yeah. So I can see the 30th mile marker out there. I'm just coasting right to that, I hope. So, but anyhow, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for listening, folks. Until the next time, go hunting, have some fun, be avid about your hunting, be avid about your conservation, and don't forget that this is about having fun.